It was super frustrating. I went with my mom to the most storied cathedrals to Western medicine, and in every instance, I experienced what I've come to call diagnose and adios. And I have a lot of respect for medicine. In fact, when I started college, I wanted to be a doctor. I was pre-med for the first few years. But truly, in none of those doctors' offices was diet or lifestyle ever really brought up.
I'm Dave Rubin, and this is the Rubin Report. As always, guys, click that little subscribe button on YouTube so you just might see our videos. Now, joining me today is a New York Times best-selling author of Genius Foods and the author of the new book, The Genius Life, Max Lugavere. Welcome back to the Rubin Report.
So good to be here. Thank you for having me.
New York Times best-selling author.
Yeah.
Were you a New York Times best-selling author last time?
I was not, no.
Yeah, you were about to become.
About to become. I didn't know it at the time. I had no idea how well Genius Foods would ultimately do, but I'm super grateful, humbled that it's reached big audience. It's now published in 8 languages around the world. It's super cool. I was in Colombia, I was in Bogota, and I had like a line of Spanish-speaking fans lined up to get their book signed, and we could barely communicate, but it was just so gratifying to see that,
How does it change one's life to become a New York Times best-selling author?
I think it's...
I mean, does it really level up the amount of stuff that you suddenly get? Because people are like, oh, this guy actually does know what he's talking about. It's not just a book about food.
Yeah, yeah, it's a credential. I'm very... I never misrepresent myself. I mean, I write about health and science, but I do it not with having a background in academia or medicine. I'm passionately curious, and it's a topic, that I think is the most important topic there is. But the fact that the book continues to be, it wasn't just sort of there's this metaphor in book sales, when you launch a book, it's like you could be throwing up either a feather or a brick. And like a feather is what you want to happen, because the feather, it goes up and then it kind of floats. The brick just ends up coming right down. And the fact that Genius Foods has kind of just stayed up, and it continues to sell well, to me is a testament to the quality of the work, really, ultimately. And as a writer, that's the best form of flattery that you can get, that your writing is embraced and that it continues to do well. So yeah, I'm super thrilled. It's given me the opportunity to write this book, The Genius Life. I have since launched my own podcast, which is also called The Genius Life. So it's allowed me to get to do what I love to do full time. And as you know, it's a great thing to be, to work for yourself and to be driven on your own steam.
Yeah, it's a pretty sweet thing, and you're building a studio in your apartment, which I know a little something about that, so that we could do a separate show on that. But for people that didn't see our first interview, we'll link to it in this so they can jump back. But one of the things I find most interesting about you, and you and I now go back like 6-7 years, so before you wrote Genius Foods, your story on how you came to kind of care about this stuff is, well, it's deeply personal, but it's also pretty fascinating, actually. Could you do like a quick recap on that?
Absolutely, yeah. I started as a journalist. I was a generalist working for Al Gore's Current TV, which was not my role there was not as a flag bearer of his political, ideas and environmental ideas. I got the job right out of college, and I got to cover stories that were important to me, and they ranged from health to technology to politics occasionally. But when I left that job after 6 years, I started spending more and more time in New York City, which is where I'm from, around my mother, and I'm firstborn child, very close to my mom. She started at the age of 58 to display the earliest symptoms of dementia. And she had a very strange confluence of symptoms. She had symptoms that were more indicative of a memory disorder, and then she had movement symptoms, which would indicate a more Parkinsonian complex, like Parkinson's disease. And it was something that was traumatic to witness, when we got the initial diagnosis.
Were you literally the first person that noticed anything, or was she noticing that something was going on?
She started to complain of brain fog, memory problems, but we didn't have the vernacular in my family. We had no prior family history of any kind of neurodegenerative disease. And interestingly, my mom's mom, my maternal grandmother, she lived to 96, and she was cognitively sharp until the end.
Wow.
So my grandmother was not demented. And so the idea that my grandma's daughter, my mom, could somehow be succumbing to this condition that I think most people assume to be an old person's disease. It just didn't compute. It didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so when my mom was initially prescribed the drugs for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, that was the first time in my life I'd ever had a panic attack. I'm a pretty chill guy, but I was alone in the hotel room in Cleveland, Ohio, Googling the drug prescriptions, which I think anybody would do in that position. And the severity of the situation really dawned on me at that moment. And from that point on, I decided to dedicate, all of my free time to investigating why this would have happened to my mom, what could be done to help her, what could be done to prevent it from happening to myself. And that began about 8 years ago. And that was a struggle, obviously, watching my mom descend and become more and more handicapped by the disease. And that's what motivated me to write Genius Foods and to do all the work that I put out. And what occurred after Genius Foods came out was, equally surprising and equally heartbreaking. I was in the middle of writing this book when my mom turned yellow. And usually if you turn yellow, it's either going to be jaundice or you've eaten too much beta carotene, you've eaten too many carrots.
Yeah.
But what happens with jaundice, the whites of your eyes actually become yellow. That's kind of what distinguishes it from just eating too many sweet potatoes. And my family rushed her to the emergency room. They did an MRI of her abdomen, and what they discovered was not a gallstone, which is typically what, it'll cause a blockage in the bile duct, cause bilirubin, which is a pigment to back up into your blood. What they found was much worse. It was a tumor on the head of her pancreas. And she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And 90% of the time when pancreatic cancer is diagnosed, it's already progressed. And it was 3 months, and she was, it was barbaric and brutal, and that's what she ultimately passed from. But the fact that my mom had these two freak health conditions, two of the most feared conditions known to humanity, it motivates me every day to learn more, to teach more, and to just stay open and curious and always be willing to challenge my assumptions and my beliefs about what it means to be healthy in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, that's why I think your story is so cool. I mean, just like you're a good guy, but you've also even when I follow you on Instagram, and you do a lot of don't eat this kind of stuff, and it's very human. You're not like beating people over the head with all this, and I want to get to some of those techniques and little tricks that you use to make things a little bit healthier. But when your mom got diagnosed, and then subsequently when you did all of the things that you tried to do over the course of that time, was anyone else talking about food? Or was it all just like, this is what you take, we'll up it here, if this happens, you do this? Like, was there any, eat more avocado?
No, it was super frustrating. I went with my mom to the most storied cathedrals to Western medicine, and in every instance, I experienced what I've come to call diagnose and adios. And I have a lot of respect for medicine. In fact, when I started college, I wanted to be a doctor. I was pre-med for the first few years. But truly, in none of those doctors' offices was diet or lifestyle ever really brought up. And the contrast between what I was experiencing in the clinicians' offices with my mom and what I started to discover in the medical literature, there was just this big valley in between the dearth of information and the despair that I was seeing there with my mom, and the optimism that I was reading about in the medical literature. And ultimately, what I did was I realized that I had media credentials, and I started to reach out to scientists and researchers who were the authors of the papers that I was reading, and they echoed that sentiment of optimism. And yet, at the point of care with my mom, what I experienced was anything but optimistic. So I really had to take it upon myself. And I think when you're a patient, my mom was scared, she was confused, she didn't have a framework for understanding health or science or anything like that. I did, because I had a lifelong passion for the topic. But really, I think there are a lot of people in her shoes that are met with the same kind of, hopelessness. And yeah, you're right. I mean, what every doctor would ultimately do would titrate up the dose of a medication that she was already on, throw something new into the mix, and by the time my mom passed, she was on 10 different pharmaceuticals. I'm not even being hyperbolic. And there's just no way that a physician can have any idea of how each of those pills are interacting with one another in a body that's growing increasingly frail and sick.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about lifestyles instead of nonstop yelling, check out our lifestyle playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, check out our full episode playlist. They're both right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.